Stop what you're doing right now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to hit your grocery bill, your gas station, your dinner table. And if you're a farmer watching this from Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, or anywhere across the American heartland, you already feel it in your gut. You already know something is badly, fundamentally wrong. And you deserve the full story, not the version they're giving you in 30-second headlines. So tonight, right here, I'm going to lay it all out. Every piece, every number, every connection the mainstream media keeps glossing over. Because this story is enormous. And it is personal to every single American who has ever bought groceries, which, last time I checked, is every single one of us. Here is what is happening. The Trump administration is escalating pressure on Canada's potash supply. And I need you to understand something that almost nobody in Washington is saying out loud right now.
The United States of America imports more than 90% of the potash it uses. And of that number, that staggering, eye-opening number, somewhere between 80 and 87% comes from a single country. One country. Canada. Let that land for a moment. The most powerful nation in the history of the world, the country that was built on independence, on self-reliance, on the idea that we answer to nobody. And when it comes to the single most essential ingredient needed to grow food in American soil, we are almost completely dependent on our neighbor to the north. That is not a political talking point. That is a national security reality. And right now, the White House is threatening what the president himself has called very severe tariffs on Canadian potash imports. I want to be honest with you. I have spent the last 3 days buried in this story. Agricultural economists, USDA reports, trade data going back years. And what I found is genuinely alarming. Because this policy, if it goes through the way it's being described, will not hurt Canada nearly as much as it will hurt the American farmer, the American family, and the American consumer. Let me walk you through exactly why. But first, if this story matters to you, if you care about what's happening to American agriculture and you want to stay ahead of every development as it breaks, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because I am not letting go of this story, and I do not want you to miss a single update. Potash is potassium chloride, one of the 3 essential nutrients in commercial fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, what farmers and agronomists call NPK. Without potassium, crops cannot regulate water, cannot resist disease, cannot build strong root systems. Yields don't dip, they collapse. This is not a nutrient you cut from the budget for a season and hope it works out. Every serious corn grower, soybean producer, and wheat farmer in America needs potash in the ground before planting season begins. And the overwhelming majority of that potash travels by rail from the mines of Saskatchewan, Canada, straight into the American Midwest. There is no backup. There is no strategic stockpile sitting in a warehouse somewhere waiting for a crisis. The United States produces a tiny fraction of what its farmers actually need. In 2024, Canadian potash mining output was 36 times larger than America's. 36 times. So when the president stands in the Oval Office and says we're going to impose severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer to build up domestic production, I need someone in that room to raise their hand and ask the most basic question imaginable. With what? With what mines? With what infrastructure? With what realistic timeline? Because building a new potash mine in the United States takes years, sometimes an entire decade, and costs billions of dollars. The Michigan Potash and Salt Company received a loan guarantee of up to $1.26 billion from the Department of Energy, and that facility is still in the feasibility stage. Sage Potash received a $14 million USDA grant to explore production in Utah, a project that might eventually produce 300,000 tons a year. American farmers consume roughly 5 million tons annually. You cannot close an 87% import gap with press conferences and executive orders. You close it with mines that take 10 years to build, and in the meantime, every single dollar of tariff cost gets passed directly to the farmer. This is not theory, this is already happening. Let me take you through the pattern that has been building since the start of Trump's second term.
In March of 2025, the administration imposed a 25% tariff on virtually all Canadian imports, potash included.
The response from the American farm lobby was immediate and fierce. Within days, the White House cut the potash tariff to 10%. Then, shortly after, potash shipped under the USMCA trade agreement was exempted entirely. That reversal tells you everything you need to know about the sensitivity of this issue. Farmers are one of this president's core political constituencies. They voted for him in overwhelming numbers, and the administration knows, it knows with absolute certainty, that if fertilizer costs spike during planting season, the pain will be immediate, it will be visible, and it will be politically devastating heading into the 2026 midterms. But despite that early retreat, the rhetoric has only intensified. In December of 2025, during a White House event announcing an $11 billion aid package for row crop farmers, a program they're calling the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program, Trump said the administration will end up putting very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer if they have to, because that's how you build domestic production. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins echoed that, saying the USDA has a whole plan for reshoring fertilizer production. When you dig into what that plan actually looks like, it is vague at best and wishful thinking at worst. An agricultural economist at the University of Illinois pointed out that any rise in U.S. fertilizer output driven by tariff protection simply means American producers are shielded from cheaper foreign imports. For farmers, that means higher costs, not lower. The chief economist at the Fertilizer Institute noted that expanding or building new fertilizer plants costs billions and takes years, and that the executive order Trump signed in November to eliminate certain fertilizer tariffs was actually a positive step. Then turning around and threatening severe new tariffs completely destroys the investment certainty that domestic producers need to commit to a billion-dollar project. Nobody builds a mine when the trade policy changes every 3 months. Nobody makes that bet. So you end up with the worst of both worlds: higher import costs from tariffs on Canadian potash, and no meaningful increase in domestic production because the policy environment is too unstable to attract serious investment. And American farmers get squeezed from both ends. Input costs are already devastating. Fertilizer alone accounts for 33 to 44% of operating costs for corn production, according to the USDA. And on the revenue side, farmers are getting hammered by trade war fallout at the same time. China, historically the largest buyer of American soybeans, barely purchased any U.S. soybeans until late October of 2025, months into the harvest season. The American Farm Bureau Federation estimates that farmers across the country lost an average of $150 per acre this year, total nationwide losses exceeding $15 billion. The $11 billion aid package doesn't even cover the full damage. It is a bandage on a wound that keeps getting deeper. The American Soybean Association has warned that this combination, low crop prices, high production costs, and collapsed export markets, will produce the longest stretch of substantial production losses for soybean farmers in 2 decades. 2 decades. That is not a rough patch. That is a crisis. And I want to be very clear here because I know there are people watching who support this president and people watching who don't. My job is not to tell you what to think. My job is to show you what the data actually says. And what the data says is that the tariff approach on potash and fertilizer is producing real, documented, measurable harm to American farmers right now. Today, not in some future scenario. The North Dakota State University Trade Monitor found that through October, tariffs on agricultural inputs collected $958 million in revenue, with fertilizer tariffs accounting for about $110 million of that. But the analysis concluded that U.S. farmers and input suppliers bore costs substantially higher than that revenue number. The tariffs cost more than they collected. Kansas farmer Nick Lewandowski, who also leads the Kansas Farmers Union, put it plainly. He said that even before tariffs, input costs were already punishing: fertilizer, seed, chemicals, equipment, fuel, land.
Tariffs add another layer of cost at the exact moment farmers are trying to plan months or even years ahead. He called tariffs tools, not toys. And he said the bottom line is simple. Farmers need predictable trade policy and stable markets to plan responsibly. Continued tariff uncertainty makes that increasingly impossible. And he is right. Farming is not a business where you pivot overnight. You make planting decisions in the fall for crops that won't be harvested until the following autumn. You sign fertilizer contracts months in advance. You commit to acreage based on projected costs and projected prices. When the government keeps changing the rules mid-season, the uncertainty is not just frustrating, it is paralyzing. Some farmers are delaying equipment purchases, others are abandoning export-dependent crops entirely. Grain sorghum, once a major crop in Kansas, sold largely through international food aid programs, has seen prices fall below $3 a bushel. Some grain elevators are saying they may not even accept more of it. That is the human cost of trade policy volatility, and it always lands on the people who can least afford it. Now let me widen the lens, because there is a geopolitical dimension to this story that almost nobody is covering, and it is both fascinating and deeply alarming. Canada's potash reserves are the largest on the planet, 1.1 billion tons, roughly 5 times larger than what the United States has in the ground. Saskatchewan alone sits on deposits so vast and so high quality that they have been feeding global agriculture for decades. But here is the critical thing. America is no longer Canada's only customer. Over the past 25 years, Canadian potash exports have diversified significantly, growing shipments to Brazil, China, and Southeast Asia. American demand has remained relatively flat during that same period. So while Washington is issuing tariff threats, Canadian producers are looking at a world of expanding global demand and saying, quite calmly, fine, we'll sell it somewhere else. Nutrient, the world's largest potash producer, recently announced plans to build a new export terminal in Washington state. Not to ship potash to American farmers, to ship it to Asian and South American markets. Think about that. Canada's biggest potash company is building infrastructure on American soil to send fertilizer to the other side of the world instead of to American farms 50 miles away. And then there is the Belarus angle. Almost nobody is talking about this, but it reveals exactly how tangled this situation has become. In December of 2025, the Trump administration struck a deal with Belarus, one of Europe's most authoritarian regimes, to lift sanctions on Belarusian potash exports in exchange for the release of political prisoners. Why would Washington care about Belarusian potash? Because if you're going to put tariffs on Canadian potash, you need an alternative supply. And the only countries capable of producing the kind of tonnage Canada provides are Russia and Belarus. But shipping potash from Belarus means ocean freight, port congestion, and rail logistics that would make the final delivered price to an Iowa cornfield dramatically higher than what Canadian rail shipments cost today. The transportation economics do not work, not even close. And yet here we are, watching the administration simultaneously threaten tariffs on the most affordable, most geographically logical potash supply in the world, while cutting deals to import it from 20,000 kilometers away. If that sounds like it doesn't make sense, it's because when it comes to actually helping American farmers, it doesn't. And the ripple effects don't stop at the farm gate. They never do. When fertilizer costs go up, crop production costs go up. When crop production costs go up, food prices go up. Not immediately. It works through the supply chain over months. But by the time consumers feel it at the grocery store, the damage is already done, and it cannot be quickly reversed. Consumer inflation has grown for 5 consecutive months and now sits at 3%, a level not seen since early 2024. Consumer sentiment, according to the University of Michigan's long-running survey, is at half-century lows. 4 of the 10 worst monthly readings in the survey's entire history have come since April. Manufacturing employment has worsened, with the U.S. shedding nearly 50,000 manufacturing jobs this year alone. These are not numbers on a screen. These are families, These are communities. These are towns across the heartland where the local economy runs entirely on agriculture, and where every additional dollar spent on fertilizer is a dollar that doesn't go to the local hardware store, the local diner, the local school district that depends on property taxes from farmland. The pain is real, and it is spreading.
I understand the argument for reducing dependence on foreign inputs. I genuinely do. Having 90% of your potash supply come from a single foreign country, even a friendly one, is a real strategic vulnerability. The U.S. added potash to its critical minerals list for exactly that reason. And there are domestic projects underway: the Michigan mine, the Utah exploration, some smaller operations. But the timeline for those projects is measured in years and decades, not months. In the meantime, you cannot tariff your way to self-sufficiency when you have no meaningful domestic capacity to fill the gap. What you can do is invest in long-term capacity building, provide stable regulatory environments that give mining companies the confidence to commit billions of dollars, and maintain the free flow of affordable Canadian potash while that domestic capacity slowly comes online. That is what the Fertilizer Institute has been advocating. That is what agricultural economists have been recommending. That is what the data supports. That is not what is happening. What is happening is the same cycle we saw in the first Trump term: trade disruption, economic pain, then emergency government payments to try to offset the damage. During Trump's first term, farmers received roughly $23 billion in trade aid. This year, total farm payments are set to reach a near-record $40 billion. And yet net farm income could still fall by more than $30 billion in 2026 due to declining support and persistently low crop prices. We are not building toward independence. We are building toward permanent subsidy dependence. And that is the exact opposite of what this policy claims to achieve. One more thing before I close, and this one is important. There are voices in Canada, including the Premier of Ontario, who have suggested Canada should weaponize its potash supply, cut exports entirely, use fertilizer as leverage in the broader trade war. Saskatchewan's Premier has pushed back hard against that idea, rightly pointing out it would devastate his own province's economy. But the fact that the conversation is even happening should send a chill through every American farmer watching this right now. Because today, at this exact moment, the only thing standing between American agriculture and a catastrophic input shortage is the goodwill of our trading relationship with Canada, a relationship this administration is actively eroding with tariff threats, price-fixing accusations, and months of confrontational rhetoric. Nutrien has publicly warned that tariff costs will ultimately land on American farmers. Industry analysts, economists, and the farmers themselves are all delivering the same message, and the threats continue anyway. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a moment where the people who grow our food are being squeezed from every direction. Higher input costs, lower commodity prices, lost export markets, a trade policy that reverses direction with every news cycle. It leaves us heading into the 2026 midterms with farm country in genuine, documented distress. And it leaves us watching a slow-motion crisis unfold in the most fundamental sector of the American economy, the one that puts food on every single table in this country. I am going to keep following this story. I am going to keep bringing you the facts, the numbers, and the real voices of the people who are living through it. If this report gave you something, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. A farmer, a neighbor, a friend who is wondering why their grocery bill keeps climbing. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave me a comment telling me how this is affecting your community. Because your stories matter, your voices matter, and this conversation is nowhere near over.